I want to dive right into reading to begin, and then we'll talk about it for a little bit. From chapter 3, I'm going to read the first 8 verses, and then we're going to jump down to verses 21 through 31 at the end. Then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Paul asks. Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision? Yes, there are great benefits. First of all, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. True, some of them were unfaithful. But just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. As the Scriptures say about him, you will be proved right in what you say, and you will win your case in court. But, some might say, our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. Isn't it unfair then for him to punish us? This is merely a human point of view. Of course not. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world? But, someone might still argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? And some people even slander us by claiming that we say, the more we sin, the better it is. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. Jump down to verse 21. But now, God has shown us a way to be made right with him without keeping the requirements of the law, as was promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago. We are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. Yet God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous. He did this through Christ Jesus when he freed us from the penalty for our sins. For God presented Jesus as the sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood. And this sacrifice shows that God was being fair when he held back and did not punish those who sinned in times past. For he was looking ahead and including them in what he would do in the present time. God did this to demonstrate his righteousness. For he himself is fair and just, and he declares sinners to be right in his sight when they believe in Jesus. Can we boast, then, that we have done anything to be accepted by God? No, because our acquittal is not based on obeying the law. It is based on faith. So we are made right with God through faith and not by obeying the law. After all, is God the God of the Jews only? Isn't he also the God of the Gentiles? Of course he is. There is only one God, and he makes people right with himself only by faith, whether they are Jews or Gentiles. Well then, if we emphasize faith, does this mean that we can forget about the law? Of course not. In fact, only when we have faith do we truly fulfill the law. It's a meaty chapter. A really, really meaty chapter. I want to begin by talking... Man, this is off again. I'm going to turn this on. The monitor keeps getting turned off. It's probably my kids. I'm just going to blame them. I'm good at blaming them. All right, let's start by talking about God's plan. And I want to talk about this plan to save the world that God has. And truthfully, this is a really big topic, right? This plan that God has to save the world. It would take me, if I were to do it justice, it would take me roughly 6,000 years to tell the story. And my guess is you don't have that kind of time this morning. So I'm going to, condense it somewhat because I don't have that kind of time. Last year, we went through the Old Testament. We talked about the Old Testament as a story, as the story of God's working with the world. And I don't know if you remember, but we each week we just took little snapshots along the way of what God was up to in his world. And the intention for that was that we would see God's plan on display in the pages of Scripture. And so what do we know of this plan? Well, Paul's going to continue to lay it out in more detail as he goes through this letter, but he begins us thinking about it right here. He mentions the idea of God's faithfulness, that God is a faithful God. Well, what could Paul mean by that? Well, I think Paul means none other than the fact that God is keeping true to the covenant that he made so many years ago. He made promises, he made guarantees to Abraham, to Noah, to David, to the Israelites. He made promises, he made a covenant. God doesn't break his word. Even when all else are liars, God is true, Paul says. And so, if that's true, if we believe that, if we know that God is true to his word, then his covenant doesn't fail. From the Israelites it does, right? But not from God. He might have fulfilled it differently than was expected. In fact, we know that he fulfilled it differently than what was expected. But Paul's claim is that God indeed has been faithful to his covenant with his people. And God fulfilled that promise in no other way than through Jesus the Messiah. And for Paul, jump back to Romans chapter 1, that is the good news. Good news equals Jesus. Right? If you want to think about it as some kind of mathematical formula, good news, gospel equals Jesus. God's plan to save the world is the best news that Paul could have ever heard, and he can't help but talk to other people about it. So what role then did the Jews have in this plan? Well, the Jews were meant to be the storytellers for God. From Abraham to the prophets, the Jews were commissioned to tell others about the God who created this universe. They had this grand story of a God who created the world, who breathed life into humanity, who brought about creatures and plants and all these things that we see and touch and taste. A God who established order and who called creation good. They had a story of a God who called particular humans to carry out his vision for the world, of a guy named Abraham whose offspring would bless the entire world. That's their story that they're supposed to tell. The prophets pick up this story, and they try to tell it as well. What I love is, if you go read the prophets, so many of them depict the story as a love story. Have you ever noticed that in the prophets? They tell this love story. It's almost like, remember those old romance novels? Anybody remember old romance novels? Like Fabio's on the front, with the long flowing hair, and he's holding this woman gracefully in his arms. That's sometimes what I think about with the prophets, that they're writing this romance novel between God and Israel. God is that's how they depict it. God is the husband, Israel is his bride. It's this romance novel, and the prophets tell of a time when that indecency that the Israelites have brought about on themselves is going to be put right. But it hadn't happened yet for them, and so they waited. And the story continued. The once chosen bride was unfaithful now. She wandered aimlessly and seemingly alone. So the prophets rebuked the wife. They rebuked Israel. They said she had failed in her covenant faithfulness. And most of us only focus on one way in which Israel failed whenever we think about covenant faithfulness. We focus on that they worshiped other gods. And that is very true. Right? We see that in Scripture, that the Israelites were consumed with the worship of other gods in their land. But that's not the only way that Israel failed God in their covenant faithfulness. One of the other ways they failed was to tell the story that I've just been talking about. They failed to present the world with the good news of God. They had it in their hip pocket their whole time. It was like playing cards. They got the ace up the sleeve. They're cheaters. They just pull the ace out anytime. Say, look, I got good news for you right here. It's in my hand. And they refused to do that. So the prophets reminded them over and over again they were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. But their light, which should have been shining brightly as though on top of a hill, was hidden under a bowl and was therefore no good at all. So if you think about the story in that way, Jesus uses a metaphor to tell that, right? He talks about a lion on a hill, and if it's put under a bowl, it's no good. He's recounting the story of Israel and how they failed to be the light that they're supposed to be. But then the fulfillment of God's plan comes to fruition, literally in this world. Jesus, God's Son, becomes manifest, incarnate as a human being, born as a small child, grows and learns and experiences life in a way that God has never experienced life before. And he walks like we do. He talks like, well, different than we do. We speak English. But he talks like we do. He has to take baths. Yeah? He has to get bathed by his mom when he's a little baby. Have his diaper or loincloth, something changed when he's a little baby. That's Jesus. And that's God's plan to save the world. And that's the good news. That's God's faithfulness to his people. That's God's faithfulness to the plan that he has to save the world, is in this small child who grows up to be a man, and then who dies and is raised again to new life. That's the good news that back in Romans chapter 1, Paul says he is so proud to proclaim. The good news of Jesus. So he talks about righteousness in chapter 3, Paul does. And he uses, if you look back at verse 21 real quick, I love how verse 21 starts. It starts with, but now. You've probably heard the phrase, the colloquial phrase that gets used. I mean, it gets told lots of different ways, but it goes something like this. If there's a but in a sentence, then everything that comes before the but doesn't matter. Anybody ever heard that phrase? Yeah, that if somebody says but, that whatever they said before, that wasn't really truthful. Everything they say after the but is what they really were intending to communicate. Paul uses this phrase, but now. I think that colloquial phrase is wrong. I don't think there's really any truth to it whatsoever. Because I think Paul is actually arguing that everything that comes before the but now is absolutely and completely important. It very much matters to Paul that we understand that everything before the but now matters. Everything after the but now also matters, but you can't leave aside what he says before. So, what does he say before? Well, he reminds the Jews and the Gentiles that he's writing to that the Jews had a very special mission to complete that we've already talked about, right? They were supposed to be a light to the nations. The but now doesn't absolve them of that neglect and their refusal to carry out that mission. It highlights how terrible their oversight was. It doesn't wash it away. It doesn't. Paul's not saying but now as in forget that. He's saying no, but now as in learn from it, right? As in do differently, be different now. You're supposed to do this. He reminds the Roman Christians that sin is not to be enjoyed and continued for the purpose of displaying God's glory through his forgiveness. Right? Did you catch that weird little moment in there where Paul says, you know, some of you are talking as though I think you should just continue to go on sinning because that somehow displays God's glory more? Of course not. Because, but now, something is different. The but now emphasizes how wrong that idea actually is. He reminds these Christians that they are all sinners. Every single one of them sitting there listening to this letter being read fall under the category of sinner. Paul doesn't let any of them off the hook. And back in Romans chapter 1, remember he gives that long list of all the sins that they're committing. And I talked about a couple weeks ago, I guess a few weeks ago, I talked about how what Paul's intending, I think, by giving that list is for every single person sitting in that audience to go, oh man, I just heard myself in what got read. That's the intention that Paul has. He's not letting any of them off the hook. You could probably imagine one or two of them, sitting back there thinking, man, I got away. right? Or there's no way he's talking about me too, but he obviously is. And so the but now in verse 21 rather, magnifies the grace of God because it displays the good news on center stage. Sin is present. Is there sin present in this room right now? Yeah. All of us ought to be nodding our heads. Yes, absolutely. I'm looking at you, you terrible sinners. And you're looking back at me, a terrible sinner. But now, God's grace is on display. God's amazing faithfulness to me as a person, to us as a community, and to the world that he wants to save is on display because God has decisively dealt with sin in Jesus. Righteousness is within your reach if only you would stretch out your hand and take it. Don't ignore what comes before the but. It very much matters. I can assure you, God is not ignoring your sin. God is not ignoring what comes before the but. Sometimes we do. I'm asking you not to. I think Paul is asking us not to. So I want to end by talking about God's faithfulness that's on display, because that's what Paul says here at the end of Romans chapter 3. It's interesting to talk about righteousness from the standpoint of how Paul talks about it in this chapter, I think. If far too often we only consider righteousness from the human standpoint as something that we have or something that is given to us by God. And I've talked about this some before in my sermons, but God's faithfulness is what Paul talks about in this chapter. God's righteousness is what Paul talks about in this chapter. And that's an interesting concept for us to try to get, I think, sometimes. And so the question has to be asked, to whom or to what is God faithful? Is God righteous? How does that idea even apply to God? And about what is God faithful? I think the answer to those questions, of course, have been the very subjects that Paul talks about in Romans 3, and therefore the subjects that I've already been talking about this morning. Paul is crafting this really beautiful argument throughout this letter. And these themes that he brings up, they continue to kind of spiral around and around. And by spiral, I mean kind of like a tornado. He goes deeper and deeper with them. So as you get down, he just drills down even further, but these points keep coming back. He's going to cycle back to them throughout the letter. So what and to whom is God faithful then? How is God made right? Well, he's made right in the fact that God is true and honest to his word. Again, the way that God fulfilled his promise to his people didn't look like what they anticipated, or like what many of them anticipated. He sent Jesus. Jesus didn't come marching through Jerusalem with an army, right? They would have preferred that. They would have preferred that Jesus sweep in with a huge army of people or angels or something, maybe just himself, like he blasts them with rays of light from his mouth or something, shoots laser beams out of his eyes like Superman. I don't know. They would have preferred something like that. That's not what they got. They got a guy who rode in on a donkey and said, "Kill me. I willingly die in this moment." That's what they got. Which is not at all what they wanted or hoped for, because it didn't get them the outcome that they thought they wanted. It got them the outcome that God needed them to have, but it's not the outcome that they wanted. And that's what Paul says God is faithful to, and that's what makes God righteous. God is righteous because he fulfilled his promise to his people. And so because of God's faithfulness, because his faithfulness was manifest in Jesus of Nazareth, who lived, who died, and who came back to life, we also can be made right with God. We also can be righteous. And that idea is sometimes, again, hard for us to hold on to because we know we're sinners. It's not easy for us to look at ourselves in the mirror and go, "I'm not a sinner. I'm righteous. And mean it humbly, right? That's hard for us to do. It's hard for us to let go of our sin, especially when we hurt other people, with our sin and what we do. It's hard for us to let go of that. But the amazing thing about God is that when we are righteous, when we are made right with Him, I truly, honestly, completely believe that He isn't, like hovering over us, staring down at us, going, sinner, sinner, I'm ready to kill that person. That's not who God is. God desires right relationship with us and is full of love and forgiveness. And so Paul declares that we're made right with God through our faith. And this, of course, is not the final thing that Paul is going to say about this subject. After all, we have 13 more chapters to go through, or at least 12. But it's a very important one that Paul brings up here. And it's interesting about faith how strangely I find that a lot of modern Christians kind of think about faith. And faith is talked about as though what we have in faith is certainty. Have you ever noticed that people talk about faith as a certainty? But the moment you start talking about faith as a certainty, it completely undermines the fact that it's faith. Have you ever thought about that? Faith, using the word faith, having faith, necessitates that it's uncertain. It's exactly what faith means. If you're certain that God is real, 100% without a shadow of a doubt, certain that God is real, that's not faith. That sounds weird for me to say, right? You're all ready to stone the preacher this morning. But that's not faith. Faith involves doubt. Faith means that you're unsure. Faith means that there are days when you wake up and you go, I don't know about this God thing. God didn't show up for me yesterday. God let this person in my life die. God allowed me to get in this car wreck, and now I'm hurt, and I can't work. Where's God in my life? That's faith. Faith isn't certain. And so the moment we become certain about our faith, it's no longer faith. And again, I know that sounds weird for a preacher to stand up and say to you, but I'm just trying to be honest with you about faith. And if we get lulled into thinking that we have to be certain about, because here's what happens. We read Christian books and we listen to Christian music and we watch, other preachers talk on the radio or on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this stuff. And they talk about being certain without a shadow of a doubt God is real. We have all these proofs for God's existence. How could anybody not believe that God is real? Because how can you just not see God? It's right there. It's 100% true. I don't think that's faith. You can't prove God's existence. If you could, faith is not necessary. And we live now in the time before the end when faith is still required. Paul says it is. You're not saved unless you have faith. And so if you're certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is real, that's not faith. Some of you may want to argue with me after church. That's fine. You can go find Danny and he'll talk to you about it. One day, faith is no longer going to be necessary. One day, I'll be able to put away my uncertainties that God is real. One day, I'll see clearly, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians. But right now, I'm looking through a foggy window. I don't see God clearly. I want to. But that uncertainty remains. And until that time, faith is necessary. And what I want to say to you is if you struggle, if you have those moments of doubt, if you have uncertainties in your life about God's existence, welcome to the club. I don't know that you're in good company, but you at least have company. I'm right there with you. That's what faith is about. So for me, I think that's a reason to celebrate. Let's celebrate our faith. Let's stop looking for false certainty, sure that we can prove that God exists, and then everyone will believe that God exists. That It's not there. That's not real. Paul says we are made right with God by placing our faith, not our certainty, but our faith in Jesus Christ. He says, and this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. I think that's really, really good news. So to close out today, first question I have for you: how is God's plan to save the world good news in your life? Paul claims it's good news. Paul can't help but tell other people about this good news. So how is God's plan to save the world good news in your life? The second thing, as the new Israel, as Paul is going to call us in Romans, and as Jesus himself calls us during his ministry, as the new Israel, what is our role in God's plan? Because it's not complete yet, right? Jesus came, but the work is not done. Everybody agrees with that? The work is not done. So what is our role in God's plan? And then finally, is there something in your life that God is saying, but now, too? It's important. Don't ignore it. Don't dismiss it. God could be saying, though, but now I'm ready to do something different with you. Now I'm ready to take you from where you are to where I want you to be. But now. Is God saying that to you about some part, some place, some time in your life? The good news is that God is faithful. God is righteous because of his faithfulness. And we can hold on to that. We can trust that, and we can believe that. Not with 100% certainty, but we can have faith in that. And so I hope that you do this morning. I hope that you're encouraged by what Paul says in Romans chapter 3. Next week we'll be in Romans chapter 4. Read along with us as we continue to look at what Paul has to say about righteousness in Romans. There may be something going on in your life this morning that you need prayers, encouragement, something that we can do for you this morning. As we stand up and sing here in a moment, we're going to have a time for you to come forward and let us know about that. Whatever it is, we want to be here for you as a family. So make those needs known as we stand and sing.